Welcome to the first Grand Round Seminar of Fall 2020 for the UAB CounterACT Research Center of Excellence in Arsenicals. My name is Mina Nabavi, and I'm a program manager with the Center's Research Education Core. For those of you not familiar with our center, the goal of the center is to develop mechanism-based, highly effective medical countermeasures against arsenical chemical warfare agents. I want to remind you of our next Grand Round Seminar, which will take place on Thursday, November 12th at 12 p.m. Central Time. This will also be a virtual webinar. Dr. Doug Wallace at UAB will be speaking, and the title of his presentation will be Chemical Warfare Exposures, Focus on Arsenical Toxicity. For more information on the center or other upcoming events, please visit our website at sites.uab.edu/arsenicals or send us an email at as33@uab.edu. So our speaker today is Dr. Andrew Nelson. Dr. Nelson is a senior member of the technical staff in the Global Chemical and Biological Security Group at Sandia National Laboratories in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He received a Bachelor of Arts in Biochemistry at the University of Colorado Boulder, a Master of Science in Environmental Science and Engineering at the Colorado School of Mines, and a Master of Public Health and a PhD in Human Toxicology from the University of Iowa. Through his experience in the academic setting, Dr. Nelson has research experience and publications in multiple disciplines, including biology, chemistry, and radiochemistry. Dr. Nelson joined Sandia National Laboratories in 2016, where he has focused on improving global chemical safety and security. He currently leads projects on chemical security in Asia, Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. He is currently leading a number of writing projects for chemical security handbooks and international guidelines, and recently served as a guest editor for the American Chemical Society Journal of Chemical Education. Welcome to UAB, Dr. Nelson.
It's a pleasure to be with you today. So today, very excited to be talking to all of you about chemical security, and really we're going to be talking about events that are defined by being low probability and high consequence, and we'll get into this more. Before that, I just wanted to mention a little bit about my background. So I came into the field of chemical security with a background in environmental monitoring, environmental risk assessment, really looking at extractive industries. And the reason I bring this up is that for those of you on the call that are in the schools of public health or trainees, postdocs that are interested in the topics that I introduced today, know that your background is actually really well suited for talking about chemical security. And additionally, as introduced by Mina, I just finished guest editing a special issue in the Journal of Chemical Education that focuses purely on chemical security. So this has topics including policy, technical approaches, classroom, laboratory experiments that educators can use, and many other topics. So if anything that I mentioned today is of interest to you, you can find out more about the current state of chemical security in this special issue. So I represent Sandia National Laboratories, which is a large federally funded research and development center based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. At least our main site is in Albuquerque. And the history of this is that we actually formed during the Manhattan Project. And then since the 1940s, we have really grown into a multi-mission laboratory where we work on a number of issues from nuclear deterrence to energy solutions, chemical research, materials research, all the way up to what I'm talking about today, the areas of non-proliferation. And as I mentioned, our main site's in Albuquerque, but we also have a large site adjacent to Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories in Livermore, California. So collectively, we have about 14,000 employees currently at Sandia. So this is just an image of, for those of you that haven't been to Albuquerque, you're always welcome. It's a beautiful city. We're in the high desert, large mountains for hiking, backpacking. It makes surviving the COVID pandemic a little bit more tolerable having somewhere to go outside and explore. So my group and center at Sandia National Laboratories really focuses on the concept of non-proliferation. And within non-proliferation, we focus on five major topics: chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and high-yield explosive materials. So we're collectively trying to prevent what we call CBRNE events. So it's just the acronym for these words. And this is really trying to prevent accidental and really intentional releases of these hazardous materials so that we can really protect life, support safety, support security, and really prosperity around the world. My group at Sandia really focuses on chemical and biological aspects of that. So we don't really, in my particular group, we don't really focus on radiological or nuclear, but we do have other groups that do focus on that. So if that's of interest to you and you want to learn more about that, please feel free to reach out to me. Within my group, we really focus on how to prevent the intentional removal. So this is theft, release, so spillage of or intentional spillage of chemicals and biological agents, and then also sabotage, which is attacking valuable materials. And we do this by really working on risk assessment, risk management systems. And throughout the talk, we won't get really deep into these because it's really the topic for the next discussion, but we talk a lot and train a lot on physical security, transportation security, material control and accountability, also referred to as inventory management, personnel management, and information security. And we work all over the world. So my group is primarily internationally facing. So we take a lot of the lessons that we've learned at Sandia over the last 80 years. And we also work with collaborators all around the world. And we're trying to build a large network of scientists, medical providers, government policymakers, basically the entire stakeholder field that's contributing to chemical security and really supporting world peace. And some of our major players that international organizations we work with include the OBCW, which I'll refer to several times today, which it's the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. This is an international body that's based in The Hague that formed in the 1990s as the housing body for the Chemical Weapons Convention, which is the global commitment to eradicate chemical weapons. We also work with a number of other partners, including the World Health and Interpol. So let's first talk about chemical safety. This is a concept that most of us are familiar with because it enters into our daily lives, especially if we're working in a laboratory. The concept of chemical safety is quite simple: protecting people from chemicals. And we do that by putting in various barriers represented by the shield. They could be PPE, so gloves, personal protective equipment like gloves, goggles. They could be engineering controls, such as fume hoods, and also policies like and procedures like standard operating procedures. And when we go internationally, we like to introduce several safety incidents because this helps really build the conversation and understanding of security. So let's first look at safety. So in the United States, there's really three major incidents that I refer to that really change the way we think about safety, particularly in the academic and research environment. The first being the accidental poisoning of Karen Wetterhahn at Dartmouth College. This happened many years ago, but this really shocked the community because this is a very skilled scientist who had done a procedure many times, was working in a laboratory, and then accidentally one day chose the wrong type of glove, and then spilled a small amount of a mercury compound that traveled right through the glove and ended up being a lethal dose that she died from several months later. So this just shows that even very experienced laboratory workers can succumb to accidents. And the case in the middle, slightly more recent, this occurred in UCLA during the time I was actually in undergraduate studies. So I remember this quite clearly. This student had just finished her studies. She was preparing to go on for professional studies. and was pulling up a syringe of a pyrophoric compound, and she slipped, and she wasn't wearing the appropriate lab coat, and her clothing caught on fire, and she ended up actually, unfortunately, dying from this fire. So this really changed the way that a lot of professors approach safety in the laboratory, and really kind of built up more movement in the community, the chemical community. And then lastly, this example from about 10 years ago at Texas Tech, there was a student who had been working on explosive compounds and was making up very small batches, and decided that it would be less work if he would just scale it up, make up more starting material so that he could do all of his experiments without having to redo the preparation steps. But in doing so, he made too much compound, and it resulted in an explosion. And as you can see, this is a picture of the lab bench that where the material actually, and for those of you that have worked on these lab benches, you know these are really hard. So there's a lot of energy that came out from this explosion, and the student lost some body parts from this. Fortunately, he lived. Now, this Texas Tech example is really important from how the US government has responded to this. So there was an investigation by the Chemical Safety Board, which is an independent US government agency that investigates major chemical accidents. And through this, they not only made recommendations to Texas Tech on how they could restructure the university so that the Environmental Health and Safety Office could have more authority and at stopping work, but they also recommended to the American Chemical Society that the American Chemical Society really develop and identify more practices and approaches to improving and controlling hazards, improving safety and controlling hazards in the laboratory. And some of the language that you see here is actually precedes this statement, but the American Chemical Society is actually quite dedicated to promoting safety. And this is actually, this language right here is pulled from their accreditation, or rather their approval guidelines for bachelor's programs in chemistry. And you can see many times they say, you see the word safety, safety conscious culture, safety awareness. So they're stressing words of safety. In fact, if you do a word search of the most recent professional guidelines, you see safety or iterations of safe occur 40 different times. Now, I primarily work in the field of chemical security. So seeing safety is of course very important. And I became very curious, well, what levels of security do you see in the American Chemical Society requirements? And I'll talk about this in just a moment. One more comment here is that the American Chemical Society is actually quite dedicated to promoting safety lessons and case studies. And one recent indication of this is that the Journal of Chemical Health and Safety that used to be published in Elsevier has actually now transitioned to the American Chemical Society. So it's now called the American Chemical Society Chemical Health and Safety Journal. And coincidentally, the editor-in-chief of this journal is my colleague, Dr. Mary Beth Mulcahy. So if you ever have questions about this journal or ideas, let me know and I can connect you with Dr. Mulcahy. So anyway, coming back to this idea of curiosity about security, I really was curious what American Chemical Study programs are doing to promote security or teach security. So I started a survey, and working with some collaborators at the University of Central Oklahoma, we distributed 691 surveys. So we surveyed every single ACS program and received responses from 189 of them. And just for your awareness, these blue dots are zip codes in which ACS programs are located. So they're all over the country, quite a number of them. So many more ACS programs than there are schools of public health. And one of the questions we asked them was, do you teach your undergraduate students chemical safety? And fortunately, almost 100% of them said, yes, they teach safety as required by the ACS guidelines for approval to be an ACS program. At the graduate level, you see that value dropping off. So I personally would prefer to see that safety education increasing to 100% for all undergraduate and graduate students. Now, unsurprisingly, when we ask them about security, the level is much lower. We see that only about a third of undergraduate chemistry programs and about a third of graduate chemistry programs teach the concept of security. And what format that comes in is a little unclear, but about a third of them are saying they're teaching security. And then another aspect of this is how often they're teaching security and safety. So within safety, we see overwhelmingly at the undergraduate level, there's quite frequent training in safety, and similarly at the graduate level, a lot of training in safety. And relatively unsurprising to me, the frequency of security training is quite a bit lower. So this is a topic that hasn't really infiltrated the American Chemical Society programs yet, and it's certainly not taught at as many of them and as frequently. So we were really kind of wondering, well, how can we go about improving security and safety culture? And we see a lot of statements that are to me are quite fascinating, that we need more commitment from practitioners, we need more commitment from non-chemistry faculty, so that would include schools of public health, biology programs, so on. And that really takes a lot of time. Well, time is money, of course, in many industries. So there needs to be some more financial investment in this. But I think this response is actually the most interesting, that people need to start giving an expletive. It's probably going to take a bad accident where someone gets hurt for that to happen. So this person's implying that security and safety culture is reactionary, that just like those case studies that we saw with Dartmouth, at UCLA, and at Texas Tech, it was after the accident happened that change came. So these are events that no one thought would ever really happen. There's such low likelihood. But we see in one case someone died, or actually in two cases someone died. In one case someone was severely injured, and the university went through extreme restructuring. So these are high consequences to safety accidents. And then really getting further into this idea of security, why aren't people teaching security? Well, we find that people are doing very creative things with safety, and they're teaching safety through scavenger hunts. But really with security, we get this theme pretty often, as highlighted in this orange text. I do not know what chemical security means, so I do not know what to teach. We see this over and over. I do not know enough about security to comment on how frequently we should present it. And then yet again, I'm not sure what is meant by security. We do not specifically address security. Our focus is on lab safety. So this theme of people not knowing what security is, so they don't know what to teach, is not only common in the United States, but it's also common everywhere we go in the world. So let's go ahead and just look at what chemical security is. So as we defined earlier, chemical safety is protecting people from chemicals, and chemical security is just the opposite in many regards. This is protecting chemicals from people. So now what we're trying to do is protect our infrastructure, our trucks, our shipments, our processes, our warehouses, and our materials and reagents from people that may have malicious or bad intentions. And we do that by putting in barriers. Some cases, these barriers or controls are very similar to safety. Sometimes they conflict, and sometimes they're independent from one another. So now let's just take a few looks at a few examples of how we got to the current state of chemical security in the United States. One of the early examples is actually the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. And this resulted in the US government passing some of the first anti-terrorism legislation and really starting to clamp down on the availability of explosive chemicals from farm stores and various other places. And on a personal note, I grew up in the city of Norman, Oklahoma, which is about 15, 20 miles south of this explosion. And I actually remember hearing this go off and wondering what it was. So this explosion really impacted the local community quite severely. And I know it also impacted the nation. And then the second incident is the World Trade Center attacks. And obviously this did not involve chemicals per se, but it did start pushing the government into thinking about how our infrastructure at large can be impacted by acts of terrorism, so security breaches. And this is where we get this legislation called the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards. These were signed into law in 2006. And this is a legislation that really establishes requirements for security vulnerability analysis and assessments at a number of different facilities throughout the United States. Many universities actually fall into this category as well. There are certain exemptions, but this legislation sets thresholds for how much chemical can be stored on site. The first time I learned about this actually was in graduate school when one of my colleagues ordered several hundred liters of nitric acid, and that triggered our threshold at the university to be exceeded, so we had to lower our order. So this is one of these cases where the economic aspect to buying a lot of chemicals is outweighed by the potential security aspect. So in addition to these changing our culture and our regulations, there are also a number of technical documents that came largely informed by these events. One of them being, and to the best of my knowledge, this is the first methodology that came out for security assessment of chemical facilities. There's a document from Sandia National Laboratories. This should be open access. You can search chemical facility vulnerability assessment methodology, and this is available from the Department of Justice. The second, and actually a very nice text, is from the American Institute of Chemical Engineers, came out in 2003. And then similarly, the methodology came out by the American Petroleum Institute for their facilities. So these are some of the first three documents that really start to push larger facilities into understanding how to control security vulnerabilities and really assess vulnerabilities on site. But to date, there's still not a lot of information and guidance available for academic settings or certainly for research laboratories. So really important question is, what do we worry about? And really a lot of the mission that we're funded to worry about, and this is coming largely from interest of our government, is really chemical weapons. And this is also a global concern as well, as mentioned by the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, is collectively committed to eradicating chemical weapons. So chemical weapons themselves are defined as toxic chemicals. So this excludes explosive chemicals, but when we use the word chemical weapons, we're specifically talking about chemicals that are used for their toxic properties to incapacitate, injure, or really kill someone by affecting various organs. And we'll talk about each of the major classes: choking, blood, blister, and nerve agents in just a moment. And then we'll kind of end on this idea of improvised chemical threats, as these are very challenging to deal with. One of the first classes that we see is the choking agents. And they're so called because they irritate the lungs and cause them to fill with fluid, and it feels like people are choking and drowning from them. One of the first examples of a choking agent is chlorine. This was one of the first toxic gases used in warfare, and this was used by the Germans against the French in the Battle of Ypres. And interestingly, this was suggested to be used by Fritz Haber, who, as many of us know, is a Nobel Prize winner for his Haber process that removes nitrogen from the air and makes ammonia for fertilizers. So you'll find actually that there's a number of very high-profile chemists that were involved in technologies that could be used for very good purposes, and unfortunately technologies that are used for very bad purposes. Another compound is phosgene. These two chemicals, chlorine and phosgene, are actually quite challenging because they're such important chemical precursors for making plastics, treating water, all sorts of different industries that really need these chemicals to make the products that we use in our daily lives. So there's a lot of challenges to really regulating these. Second major class are blood agents, so-called asphyxiants, and they really just interfere with the body's ability to transport oxygen from the lungs to the tissues. Two major examples of these are hydrogen cyanide and cyanogen chloride. Hydrogen cyanide, unfortunately, was used by the Germans in World War II for various purposes, particularly for kill camps, unfortunately. It's a extremely toxic chemical that, of course, many researchers are looking at and use for different purposes. Another challenge with this is, again, this dual nature of these chemicals. So hydrogen cyanide or various cyanide compounds are used in gold extraction as a replacement for mercury. So there's a number of industries that still use these toxic chemicals, and we still need them, so they're still present in our daily lives. The next major class are the nerve agents, and these interfere with the body's nervous system, particularly interfering with acetylcholinesterase and the ability for the body to remove acetylcholine from the nerve synapse. And major examples of these are taboon, sarin, soman, and VX. Taboon was actually one of the first ones discovered, and it was discovered by the man Gerhard Schrader, a German pesticide researcher who was really looking for ways to improve food production in Germany. But due to the laws in Germany about finding toxic chemicals, he had to report it to the government. And then that set off the German government really investing in the development of stockpiles of taboon during the World War II time period. They never used it during the war, but they certainly invested heavily in it. And these organophosphates have been used throughout time, starting really first in the 1980s during the conflicts between Iraq and Iran. But this example here in the bottom left is actually from a cult called Aum Shinrikyo, and they used sarin gas, another organophosphate. They used it on the Tokyo metro and certainly caused some deaths and panics in the city. The next major class, and the last major class we'll talk about, is the vesicants, or the blister agents. They're so called because they make these horrific blisters on the body. And this, I understand that our cynical groups, your center would understand these quite well. Lewisite, of course, containing arsenic. These are unfortunately still used today in warfare, and another challenge with these is that they have precursors that are used for making materials like detergents and hand sanitizers. So there's a number of dual use issues that make these very challenging to control. So speaking of dual use materials, this is a topic that we really work a lot with with our stakeholders internationally, because there are so many compounds out there that can be used for legitimate purposes, or that can be misapplied to make a number of different illicit materials, such as drugs, such as like methamphetamine, explosives, chemical weapons, and really all of these can impact human health, public health. And so they're, in some cases, they're national security concerns. Just as a distinction, many people in the field use the term dual use, but the OPCW uses this term multi-use. So if you might see this used different ways, but in general, it refers to the same idea that compounds can be used for good, or they can be used for bad. And we just need to manage that. Another example of dual use materials are these pharmaceutical based agents. And these are really more of an emerging area of concern. And there's actually a paper in 2020 that talks about some of these more specifically. But certainly in the medical community and hospitals, you'll find opioids. Of course, we're being ravaged by the opioid epidemic in the United States. Psychedelics can be used along as anticholinergics, GABA modulators, neuroleptic anesthetics, and various other compounds have at least been suggested as compounds that could be used, although there's not a lot of examples, at least in the open literature, of them being used directly for harm. One of the most high-profile cases and examples of pharmaceutical-based agents is in 2002, when the Dubrovka theater was sieged. There were attempts to remove the individuals from the theater using opioids. And unfortunately, the opioid concentrations were too high, and hundreds of people died. So at least when I first got into this field of chemical security, I was kind of thinking, why are we still worried about chemical weapons? That was something from World War I and maybe Aum Shinrikyo. But unfortunately, chemical weapons still remain a threat today. This is an example of an assassination that occurred in 2017 in Asia. This is the brother of the current leader of North Korea, and he was attacked by two women in the airport in Malaysia, and later he died from these exposures, and it's believed that it was an organophosphate poison. Coincidentally, I was in the same airport about 2 days later in 2017, and it was like nothing happened. Everything was back to normal business. But the main point is that there are still chemical weapon threats occurring today, and they appear to be occurring with greater frequency. Case in point, over the last 10 years during the surge of ISIS, the growth of ISIS, or also referred to as Daesh, there have been reports of suspected poisonings and chemical weapon attacks in Syria and Iraq that either involved chlorine or sulfur mustard agents. And there have been people that have died from these exposures. So for more information on this, you could look at the New York Times report link that's here. And then even more troubling is the recent and ongoing events of chemical weapon attacks that are occurring in Syria. And I apologize for the heavy text on this slide, but this is whenever there's attribution like this, it's really important to show where that source is coming from. So in this case, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons has performed a fact-finding mission in Syria, and with a high level of confidence has suggested that the Syrian Arab Air Force, so the Syrian government, has several times attacked using sarin, affecting at least 16 people. On a different incident, they released chlorine. So these are like barrel bombs. This is where they take a helicopter over and they just push a chlorine container out. And this has affected at least 30 people in this incident. And then on a third event, a bomb containing sarin was released, affecting at least 60 people. So if you'd like more information on this, there are lengthy reports that explain this from the OPCW website. And the most troubling thing that I find about this, apart from of course the conflict and people being hurt, is that there's this changing norm around the use of chemical weapons and international tolerance for it for them being used. But one benefit or one consequence of the allegations of chemical weapon use early on in the Syria conflict is that the Syrian government was actually encouraged encouraged to join the OPCW. So they now are a member of the OPCW, and that means they must allow inspections of their facilities. So why would someone want to use chemical weapons? Why not use more traditional weapons like explosives or guns, which are generally more, you might, looking at the data, would suggest that it's more effective at killing people. One is the attractiveness. Chemical weapons are available everywhere. So you can, at least in the United States, in theory, you could go buy chemicals that could be maliciously used from hardware stores. You could certainly from laboratories find these. There's certainly the potential for mass casualties, though other weapons are certainly better at that. I think really the main reason is this making a political statement. When we see high-profile assassinations with nerve agents occurring around the world, that's clearly a political statement. When we're seeing the Syrian government use chemical weapons against civilians, that is certainly evoking fear, shock, and panic. So there's very strong emotions that are associated with chemical weapons, a lot of fear associated with it. And just think, at least in our daily lives, there's this negative association with chemicals in general. So now thinking of a chemical weapon added on top of that, there's a huge psychological response to that. And then unfortunately, there's also this potential for first responder victims. And this can occur in several ways, where either there's an attack that happens and first responders respond to that, they come to the site, and then there's a second attack on the first responders, or alternatively with chemicals, some of them have persistence in the environment and could potentially hurt first responders when they arrive on scene. And then of course there's the cleanup aspect of it. There's a lot of contamination that comes from this. Businesses are shut down, roads are shut down, and it's expensive and a huge hassle to clean up from these chemical weapons. So, you know, currently we've talked about 4 different types of threats. We've talked about potential states attacking and assassinating individuals. We've talked about states having localized impacts, large scale impacts from the German government back in the early 1900s. We've also talked about terrorist attacks such as ISIS attacking communities in Iraq and Syria. But there are also a number of other potentials that are actually probably more likely to impact universities and some of the communities in the United States, to include localized impacts from, this is Timothy McVeigh, who actually attacked Oklahoma City, and then Dr. Arent, who acquired chemicals from his employment in the United States and was able to injure people. So, you know, there's a wide range of people that might want to take chemical weapons, and their motivations are different for different reasons. So how can we really reduce the likelihood of these intentional malicious uses of chemicals? And that's really what we work on, is really trying to implement risk management systems. So the first step, in my opinion, is commitment. We need commitment from employees. We need commitment from management and resources to do this. And this commitment topic is not easy. It sounds easy, but there's a lot that goes into that. And once we have commitment to really make risk assessment work, risk management work, we have to first assess what chemicals do we have, what materials do we have, and really plan so that we can allocate resources appropriately to reduce the risks. It's not every institution has unlimited funding. Actually, I don't know of any institution that has unlimited funding. So we have to, this is why we do a risk assessment, really to prioritize our resources. And then we can implement security upgrades, and I'll mention a few of these in closing. And then once we've put in an upgrade, we have to monitor, make sure it's working as intended. If it's not working, we have to improve it and start the whole process over again. To date, there are no international standards or strict guidelines that apply to chemical security for laboratories or really for academic settings. There are some for workplaces for safety, and they can, certainly you can understand a lot about a risk management system by reading these. ISO, the international standards body, has systems on health and safety, and so does the American Institute for Chemical Engineers. They have guidelines for risk-based process safety, so this really applies more to the process industries. And then currently, the ISO body is actually working on a biorisk management for laboratories. And this standard, certainly there's input from our group and many other groups around the world on this standard, but there's a lot we can learn from the biorisk management that applies to chemistry as well. So, you know, this idea of low likelihood, high consequence, there's more to it than just those two components. The likelihood is really, in security, is really 3 different variables. One is asset attractiveness. So this is how readily available is a chemical, how much does someone want it? The threat, of course, the type of threat you're dealing with can increase the likelihood. Is it an insider threat, so someone that works at the university, or is it someone from outside? And this is an important distinction because insiders and outsiders have different levels of understanding of the security processes and various other aspects at the university or the laboratory or whatever facility you're working in. And then lastly, on the likelihood bucket, we have security posture. So this is what kind of security systems and features do you have in place to detect any sort of security breach and respond to it. And then in the consequence area, we have the hazards and threats. So, hazards and assets. So these two features are really intrinsic to the chemical or the piece of equipment. There's not a lot of control that we have over the hazards. Similarly, as we sit in the laboratory as chemists or scientists or researchers, we don't have a lot of control over the threats or the adversaries, nor do we have any real control over the attractiveness. These are issues that are outside of our control. They're largely government responses. But what we can do is really improve security. So one of the things that we can do to further reduce the likelihood of something bad happening is to really focus on increasing security. But again, we need to think about what types of materials actually need more security, because we don't want to waste a bunch of time improving time or resources improving security around something that doesn't need it. And we actually just published a chemical security handbook, security risk assessment for laboratories, in June 2020 this year. So this is a document that was edited by myself and Dr. Mary Beth Mulcahy, and contributions from our whole team on how to perform a risk assessment and then start to think about what upgrades to apply. And just further information about risk assessment, there's many different ways to do this, and we're not suggesting you have to do it our way. There are simple risk assessments from mental processes by an individual thinking, last time I did this process, the beaker blew up on me, I probably shouldn't do that again, to conversations between multiple people. So this could be you talking to your colleagues, like asking for them to check your work, for a rundown between the hazards you're working with. And then what this document really gets into is a structured process on how you can qualitatively assess risks. And this is more of a performance-based approach, so we don't prescribe any way to do it, because risk assessments are really hard, they're really complex, and they're not necessarily a linear process. And we try to capture that as well as we can in this document. Within this risk assessment methodology that we present, we really ask 5 questions. The first being, what do we have? So this is, what chemicals do we have on site? So in the Center for Arsenicals, certainly you have potential chemicals that could be used to make mustard agents, right? So you know that might be something you think about. Who would want it? So now you have to think about what types of threats, what types of adversaries would want it. And then, should we be concerned? This is really the combination of what do we have, which is the consequence aspect of risk, and who would want it, so the likelihood. So when we get to this, should we be concerned, that's the assessment of risk. And once you have a risk assessment, there's really this really important question of, is this acceptable? And that's something that we can't necessarily answer for you. It's something that has to come from you and from your institution about the acceptability of risk. Can you tolerate a high risk? And if not, then you need to start having conversations on, what do we do about it? And this is the security risk upgrade area. So as a reminder, in chemical safety, we're really worried about unintentional acts. So these are accidents. And we tend to focus on protecting people from corrosive impacts of chemicals, acute impacts of acute toxicity, flammability, explosivity, and oxidizers or other reactive chemicals that could hurt the body. And then in security, we're doing exactly the opposite. We're thinking about, how do we protect the chemicals from people? And we often think about the same underlying intrinsic properties of chemicals to include corrosivity, toxicity. So corrosivity could be used for acid attacks, for example, acute toxicity in poisonings or mass casualties, flammability for fires and secondary reactions, explosions, of course, which we have seen in the United States at unacceptable frequencies, in my opinion, and as well we've seen this in very recently in Beirut. We saw a large explosion there, and then also oxidizers, which actually the explosion in Beirut involved oxidizers, ammonium nitrate. So a lot of these things we're worried about people accessing to make explosives, make bombs, fires, and various other malicious acts. But on top of that, in security, we have other things we're thinking about. And this is what makes security kind of challenging, that not only do we have to worry about chemicals that are directly toxic, but we also have to worry about chemicals that can be turned into toxic properties, turned into toxic chemicals, so precursors. And that's one of the wonderful things about the OPCW is they publish lists on what are very common precursors. So you can go to the OPCW website and they can help you identify these precursors. Certainly illicit drug production. This is a big issue in the United States for methamphetamine production. So we have to worry about not only the active agent, like if say we're worried about ketamine, we don't have to only worry about ketamine, but we have to worry about potential precursors in the laboratory that could be used to make ketamine. And then of course, explosives and chemicals that could be stolen and sold for high value. So in summary, chemical security is this idea of protecting chemicals from people. So we're trying to protect not only chemical bottles and such, but also chemicals that are being used in transportation, chemicals that are and chemical processes, chemicals that are stored in warehouses, and also directly in your line of work for chemicals that occur in the laboratory. So with that, if there are any additional questions, totally happy to take them. And if we run out of time, here's my email address at the bottom. Please feel free to reach out to me. We're always happy to be a resource to the nation and happy to answer any questions that you may have. And we didn't really have a lot of time to talk about these 5 sub areas of security, but we in the chemical security handbook talk a lot about physical security and how it works, and how this is actually a really refined science on how to improve security in physical and transport inventory management. And one side comment on inventory, we do actually have free software that can be used in laboratories. It's freely available from websites. So if you want to reach out to me, I'll gladly provide that to you. And then we also provide some other ideas in the handbook on how you can improve personnel management to reduce, say, the insider risk, and improve information security to prevent breaches of security. So with that, I'll close and start taking questions.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. I noticed a couple of you were raising your hands throughout the seminar. Again, this is in listen-only mode, so please type your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to them all. So we've had several questions come in, Dr. Nelson. At the PI level, we are required to secure the hazardous drugs and chemicals and secure our labs. Security seems to be an institutional responsibility. This person said, when I was back in Colorado, someone repeatedly stole HCl from a lab, which was noted at a point, and an alarm was sounded. How do you think each chemical should be secured or maybe accounted for?
Right. So that's first of all, that's great that University in Colorado was responding to that. I think it's a very difficult approach, because certainly there's in a laboratory you're constantly using chemicals, and so there's an ability to let's say obscure the system and actually steal. It would be theoretically possible to steal small quantities of chemicals unnoticed. Whereas certainly if you're stealing larger quantities, like if large bottles are disappearing, different story. But one way to really start addressing this, and this is actually an approach that helps with safety as well, ties into this idea of personnel management, that if you always have 2 people on site working, your chance of chemicals being stolen is greatly decreased. And this also improves safety. For instance, I know when the various labs I've worked in, there was never a strong commitment to always requiring 2 people. It was more a concern for getting the work done, which of course the work has to get done. But I remember working in the lab late hours at night, and also hearing stories of colleagues that would be in the lab until 1 or 2 in the morning by themselves. And this would be in, say, an organic synthesis laboratory, which have a number of flammable hazards. So if you have 2 people in the laboratory, if someone gets hurt, there's always another person to help potentially respond. And then also there's generally less chance that someone will be stealing chemicals during the day or during the night, wherever it may occur. But I mean, like certainly students and employees are creative, and this is why the insider risk is really hard to manage, because we know the security system, we know when people are leaving, we know how to get away with things. So that's really where it largely takes a culture and collective commitment to it.
Dr. Athar just had a comment that we don't have any high-risk war-grade chemicals in our labs, as we do most of our experiments with MRI Global. Another question, are research labs and universities also subject to the regulation regarding security like chemical industries? They said, I believe you mentioned an act signed into law in 2006. Does this cover research labs?
So the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards does regulate universities, but I believe there are some exemptions to it on certain thresholds. So if you were to go to the Department of Homeland Security's website, you can look up what's called the Chemicals of Interest list. And in that list, it's a publicly available list, and it lists all the thresholds at which certain security vulnerability assessments and various government regulatory triggers are put in place. And my understanding is that universities fall under that. There's some, and I have to apologize because I mostly work internationally facing, and we actually don't recommend the use of CFATs directly in our international settings, because the CFATs was really designed for the United States, and it doesn't necessarily apply to other countries. But my understanding is that in universities, there's some discussion about, is the university itself, say, is the University of Alabama, Birmingham, one institution, one facility, or is the School of Public Health and its building a separate facility? Is the medical school a separate facility, and so on? So there's a lot of different certainly caveats to it, and I'm not an expert in that, but if that is something that's of interest to you, I certainly know people at Sandia that were involved in CFATs and can help answer your questions more directly.
Another question, what is the role of healthcare providers like ER docs and paramedics in chemical security?
Absolutely, great question. First, there's a publication in the Journal of Chemical Education on this very issue. There was a survey that was done of EMT providers in the Southeast, and it talks about their understanding of security and their potential role. But to elaborate on that more, this is a fascinating topic where in some cases, EMTs are the first to arrive on scene, and they can really start to notice if something doesn't add up. And there's a wonderful video on this from Interpol. Healthcare providers are certainly in contact with people all around the world, or certainly within their community. They have a lot of contact with people in their community, and they can really start to notice when something's not right. And then there are reporting mechanisms where they can really start to notify government agencies that something's not right, that there's this weird chemical burn that showed up, but this person doesn't work with chemicals and they have no reason to have these chemicals. So really it's, there's an awareness element that the medical community can have to really start preventing larger scale chemical attacks. But this starts to really get into this idea of patient confidentiality. So there are some nuances to this, and I think Dr. Kazi at Emory University could help elaborate on some of those nuances some more.
I think we have time for just one more question. So what is the educational background of someone that wants to pursue a career in chemical security? Are jobs only available in national labs like Sandia, or are there other job opportunities for chem security professionals at universities or in industry?
So that's an excellent question. So within the US government, there are certainly many areas for working in chemical security. So there could be research focuses. A lot of those are at national laboratories. There are also large companies. MRI was mentioned. I believe they're in Kansas City, but they do more of like toxicology assessment, if I understand correctly. There's also large companies like Battelle that do this type of work. There are government programs that are involved in overseeing outreach engagements, one being the Department of State Chemical Security Program. Also, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency is involved in this sort of work. There are international organizations that are committed to this, one being the Organization for the the OPCW. There are national laboratories. Of course, Sandia is heavily involved in this area, but there's also the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, I believe Argonne National Laboratory, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. So there are a number of national laboratories that are working in these spaces in a variety of different applications of chemical security. And then within academia, this is an area that I don't think has really been explored fully, and some of that's likely due to the fact that there's not a lot of research associated with, certainly on the education side of chemical security, so there's not a lot of large-scale R01 grants. But then within industry, of course, there are people that are doing security vulnerability assessments, and this is in a number of industries like the petroleum industry and other chemical process industries. So there's a lot of different opportunities to work on security. In some cases, you might work in a position that has multiple roles to include environmental health and safety, chemical safety. But certainly it's a growing field, and it's an area of a lot of interest to not only the United States government, but to a lot of other governments around the world.
Well, that's all the time we have for questions today. Thank you, Dr. Nelson, for speaking on this very important and relevant topic. As a reminder to our attendees, an evaluation will be available right after the end of this seminar, so please complete that before you close your browser. This recording will be available on our center's website in the next couple of days. I also want to tell everyone Dr. Nelson recorded a podcast a few days ago with us, and that's also available on our website. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone, for your attention. Appreciate it.